This is not a conventional briefing on the Middle East. It is an inquiry into something far more fundamental, into the architecture of belief that precedes conflict, shapes it, and ultimately sustains it. Today, we are not merely asking why nations go to war. We are asking a more unsettling question. Under what conditions does war become, in the minds of those who choose it, a rational act? To answer this, we must move beyond diplomacy, beyond strategy, beyond economics. We must enter the domains of political psychology, religious consciousness, and collective cognition. Because war, in its deepest sense, does not begin on the battlefield. It begins at the moment when a society decides what it cannot afford to lose, what it fears most, and what it is willing to sacrifice everything to preserve. And in that moment, war has already begun. Let us consider the case of Iran, not as a geopolitical actor alone, but as a living system of meaning. At the heart of this system lies a profound inversion of a concept that in the Western tradition is often taken for granted: the meaning of death. Within the ideological structure of the Iranian revolutionary state, deeply influenced by Shia martyrdom narratives, death is not interpreted as defeat. It is not failure. It is not an end. It is instead a form of selection, a sign of being chosen. This perspective finds an intriguing philosophical parallel in the ancient text, often referred to as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which suggests that death is not a termination, but a transition, a passage of consciousness into another state of being. In both frameworks, the physical body is secondary. What endures is belief, identity, and continuity of meaning. Now consider the strategic implications of such a worldview. If death is not the ultimate loss, then deterrence loses its force. If sacrifice is not tragedy, but transcendence, then escalation becomes not a risk, but a reaffirmation. And when leaders fall, they are not seen as weakening the system, but as strengthening it, confirming that the system itself is aligned with a higher purpose. At this point, we must confront a critical conclusion. Negotiation from within this structure is not merely a strategic option that can be accepted or rejected. It is something far more dangerous. It is a negation of identity. Because to negotiate in this context is to imply that the foundational beliefs of the system are negotiable. And if those beliefs are negotiable, then the system itself begins to dissolve. This is why what appears to be rational compromise from the outside can appear as existential betrayal from within. So we arrive at a paradox. They are not acting irrationally. They are operating within a different framework of rationality. Where we prioritize survival, they prioritize preservation of identity. And this divergence is not a minor ikhtilaf. It is the fault line upon which entire regions destabilize. Now we must go deeper. Why is it that within such a system, moderate voices tend to disappear, while hardliners persist and consolidate power? This is often misinterpreted as a simple struggle for dominance, but that interpretation is superficial. The deeper mechanism is evolutionary, not biological, but psychological and structural. It is not a question of who wins. It is a question of which mindset can survive. Within the Iranian Revolutionary Guard structure, loyalty supersedes performance, ideology supersedes policy, and belief supersedes calculation. This is not incidental, it is systemic. Imagine a system in which advancement is not determined by competence alone, but by demonstrated allegiance to a central ideological authority, embodied in this case by figures such as Ali Khamenei. In such a system, the selection pressures are clear. Those who question are filtered out. Those who hesitate are sidelined. Those who align completely, visibly, and consistently are elevated. Over time, this produces a form of cognitive convergence, not diversity of thought, but uniformity of conviction. And within that uniformity, moderation becomes not just unpopular, but unsustainable. Let us examine how this manifests. In nuclear negotiations, the cost of sanctions may be severe. But abandoning the revolutionary identity is perceived as more costly still. In regional conflicts, such as support for the regime of Bashar al-Assad, economic strain is tolerated because the preservation of an ideological axis is deemed essential. In tensions with Israel, de-escalation may offer tangible diplomatic benefits, but it risks undermining a core narrative that legitimizes the system internally. From a purely instrumental perspective, these choices may appear inefficient, even self-destructive. But from within the system, they are coherent because they serve not the logic of optimization, but the logic of preservation. Now consider the internal dynamics. In a performance-based system, failure leads to correction. But in a loyalty-based system, failure can lead to reinforcement if it demonstrates commitment. A failed operation, if framed as sacrifice, can strengthen ideological cohesion. A harsh suppression of dissent, even if it damages legitimacy externally, can reinforce credibility internally by signaling unwavering resolve. And thus, a feedback loop emerges, one in which collective psychology reshapes reality. People come to believe what is collectively affirmed, not necessarily what is empirically true. Political psychology enforces silence because speaking deviation carries existential risk. Military psychology sustains tension because external threats unify internal divisions. And mass psychology completes the structure through repetition, narrative, and emotional investment. At this stage, we are no longer observing policy decisions. We are observing a self-reinforcing system of belief. And within such a system, truth becomes secondary to coherence. This brings us back to a warning embedded in ancient philosophical traditions. Human beings are often given the opportunity to confront uncomfortable truths, but more often than not, they retreat into familiar illusions. This is not merely an individual tendency. It is a collective one. Nations, like individuals, can choose illusion over disruption, continuity over transformation. And here lies the final insight for today. States do not always act to survive. Some states act to remain themselves, even if the cost is conflict, even if the cost is isolation, even if the cost is war. So the question we must carry forward is not simply geopolitical. It is existential. What happens to a system when only one kind of belief is allowed to survive? In our next lecture, we will pursue this question further. Why does speaking of negotiation become an act of betrayal? Why does silence become a rational survival strategy? Why do the most extreme positions often become the safest ones to hold? And most importantly, why do people, even when they sense the truth, choose not to speak it? If this perspective has added depth to your understanding, consider subscribing and share. These are not distant issues. They are reflections of enduring patterns in human systems, patterns that transcend borders, cultures, and time. Because in the end, history does not change direction when facts change. It changes when belief does.